Alrighty, well, we are afternoon and we have a large number of folks already with us this afternoon. Thank you everybody for joining. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to get us started. So this month, the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration is pleased to present accessory dwelling units, state, local, and builder perspectives. And Joe will handle speaker introductions shortly, but I just wanted to throw up this screen so everybody can view our list of speakers who will be sharing their insights with us this afternoon. I just want to run through a couple of quick housekeeping items. We really do encourage questions throughout this webinar. Feel free to use the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box to send in your questions. That will just help us keep track of all inquiries. And we'll have a formal Q&A at the end of the webinar. You can also use the raise hand feature to request to be unmuted if you'd prefer to ask your question out loud, and that will be done at the end of the webinar. The chat box will remain open as there will be a few opportunities to answer some open-ended questions provided by our speakers. And you will also see a poll populate on your screen as presenters go forth this afternoon. And that will just be a simple poll just to get some information as to where you and your locality or region stands with ADUs. I am going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen to allow Joe to further introduce this webinar, but please keep your eyes peeled on the chat box. I will be sharing some helpful links to the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration YouTube page, to our website page, and to the CM listing where you can find this webinar as well. We have a record number of folks with us this afternoon for our webinar series, and we're thrilled with that. There is a live stream due to the fact that we have maxed out attendee capacity on this Zoom. So not only is this being live streamed on the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration YouTube, but you will also be able to find it there in the coming days. To watch if you're unable to watch it in its entirety this afternoon. So thank you everybody for joining. Looking forward to this very hot topic webinar, and I'll hand it over to Joe.
Thank you, Jillian. Screen. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're very, as Jillian said, very excited for the large number of people here. Here for the accessory dwelling unit, state, local, and builder perspectives. You're familiar with the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration. We're a group, the group of the logos shown on the screen, and we're focusing on housing this year, doing a series of housing webinars every month. First, I want to introduce the panel. My name is Joe Griffiths. I'm the Director of Planning Best Practices for the Maryland Department of Planning. I'm going to discuss ADU research, analysis, and legislation at the state level in Maryland. Then we'll move on to Lynn Miller. Lynn is the Assistant Planning and Zoning Officer for Anne Arundel County. Lynn will discuss Anne Arundel County planning, legislation, and implementation efforts to help realize ADUs as a viable housing option. And we'll finish with Mike Novotny, the founder and principal of Backyard Homes Building Company. Mike will share the perspective of ADU owners and builders and how jurisdictions can design their ordinances and programs to support ADU development. Following this path, we're going to start at a very high state level with me and then drill down throughout the webinar. The learning objectives for today's webinar on the screen. Hopefully, if we do our job following the webinar, attendees will be able to explain common best practices, propose changes to local ordinances and programs, understand the challenges of builders and property owners, understand the pool of people who benefit from ADUs, and advocate for ADU development and programs in their communities and offices. And just so you know, attendees are eligible for 1.5 AICP CM credits, and that number is shown on the screen. All right, but first we'll start off with a poll. A pretty simple poll, and Jillian will help me bring this up. Does your jurisdiction permit ADUs, or do you work with jurisdictions that do? Yes, no, not sure.
Alrighty, that should be launching on everyone's screen. I will wait till we're at about 80% completion rate.
Okay, 66% yes. And that's great to hear. And we know that there's a lot of variation on what it means to permit ADUs in a jurisdiction, how they're permitted, the other requirements they have. We're going to go through a lot of those today, but it's good to know that such a large amount of you are working communities that have some form of ADU allowance. The next one is not a poll. Just we would like you to put in the chat what is the biggest barrier to ADU development in your community or the communities you work with. Because we have such a large number of people joining today, we're not going to the panelists are not going to be able to address all these barriers, but hopefully you all can read what your fellow attendees put in there, see if you have some of the share some of the same barriers, and hopefully we'll address some of them today as we go through the three-stage process. Please enter those in. Give you a moment to do that. Okay. All right, first, I want to talk a little bit about the Maryland Department of Planning. We do not have planning and zoning authority, but we do review and comment on plans, develop and share best practices, inform policy, and aid Maryland's jurisdictions in their implementation of state planning requirements. MDP proposed and shepherded SB 266 and HB 286, shown on the screen here, during the 2024 General Assembly session, which replaced Maryland's 12 planning visions with the 8 sustainable growth principles. Starting on October 1st of this year, 2025, all comprehensive plans adopted in Maryland are required to implement these principles. One principle is housing, circled on the screen, which intends to enable a mix of quality housing types and affordability options to accommodate all who want to live in the state. ADU ordinances, which can be used to implement comprehensive plans, are one potential strategy to advance this principle. The Maryland General Assembly adopted SB 382 during the 2023 session, establishing the Accessory Dwelling Unit Policy Task Force. MDP Secretary Rebecca L. Flora chaired the task force, and I staffed it, but many MDP and other state agency staff members contributed to its work. As so often happens, at least in state legislation, a draft state bill that would have mandated ADUs in some form throughout Maryland, which was proposed during the 2022 and 2023 sessions, was converted during the legislative process into a bill to have a task force examine the topic, which we did. On the slide, you can see the tasks which SB 382 assigned to the task force, including a representative sampling of state and local laws, best practices for streamlining and standardizing ADUs, and to develop legislative and policy recommendations to the governor and General Assembly that address practical issues, housing markets, and neighborhood livability. SB 382 established the task force membership shown here, including Secretary Flora and a representative of the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development. We also added representatives of the Maryland Departments of Aging and Disabilities as ex officio task force members. The task force met 9 times from September 2023 through May 2024 and produced a final report on May 31st, 2024. Linked on the top here, and you all received this presentation, is to the webpage we dedicated to the task force, which has the report and many other resources. MDP and DHCD staff initiated the research and inventory process in the summer of 2023 and engaged the task force in an iterative and topical deliberation process that I will detail in the upcoming slides. This table shows the SB 382 assigned tasks on the left and the research methods that staff and the task force used to address those tasks on the right. For sampling, the task force inventoried and reviewed other state ADU bills and ADU ordinances for all Maryland jurisdictions. As the task force worked its way through the 9 meetings, we used examples from these inventories to focus on specific topics, which I will describe in a couple slides. For best practices, streamlining and standardizing, the task force reviewed ADU best practices literature and local and state ADU handbooks. To help with legislative and policy consideration, the task force conducted focus groups, distributed 3 surveys, and solicited public feedback during every meeting and through an online commenting forum. Staff wrote a public comment report as an appendix in the final report. Staff, with the help of an intern, also completed an ADU market assessment, which was a qualitative literature review of how ADUs impact housing markets and neighborhood livability. Shown on the screen are the focus groups / panel discussions we conducted, as well as the surveys. One survey that's not shown on here was an initial survey at the very beginning of planning directors. So related to the various topic areas here, we did a panel discussion with planning directors who had recently implemented ADU changes. We did a focus group with ADU owners, residents, and accessibility and aging advocates. We did a panel discussion with community associations and HOA representatives. And our final one was a focus group and subsequent interviews with housing organizations and housing advocates. And then you'll see 2 other surveys we conducted on the right, builders and developers and environmental groups. Shown here are the topics related to ADUs that the task force addressed in an iterative fashion, about 1 to 2 each meeting. For each, staff compiled best practices and examples from other state bills and Maryland ordinances related to that meeting's topic. As available, focus group, public comment, and survey input were inserted into the topical discussion. The task force would then consider these inputs and deliberate, draft policy and legislative recommendations related to that topic. In between meetings, staff would draft and share these recommendations, and we would consider them at the next meeting for refinement. So the topics we discussed, again, 1 or 2 per meeting, were by right versus conditional or special exception approval, lot requirements. For this one, we did a scenario exercise, design and building codes, parking, community facilities and code enforcement, utilities and fees, affordability and government assistance to homeowners, and restrictive covenants. So SB 382 required the task force not to just address legislative recommendations, but also develop best practices. And the task force organized them around the topics shown here. The size of the rectangles generally communicates the amount of time the task force spent discussing each topic. So by right approval was a big topic. And I will say that there's a link here to the final report, and you can find more details about best practices related to each of these that developed by the task force in that final report. But I will go through each one as well. For by right approval, best practice founded by the task force was to permit 1 internal or attached ADU by right on any lot in which a single-family residential unit was similarly permitted by right, to permit a detached ADUs by right on any lot in which a single-family residential unit is similarly permitted by right, but with additional conditions to ensure that the ADU massing is subordinate to that of the primary dwelling unit. Establish objective conditions for local approval of ADUs that address measurable requirements such as massing, entrance locations, connections to public utilities, and square footage, but these should not include subjective criteria such as neighborhood compatibility or adverse impacts. We talked a lot about parking requirements as well. This is almost every single meeting. Best practices recommended by the task force are to eliminate off-street parking requirements for ADUs developed within 0.75 miles of a transit stop or station, to never require more than 1 off-street parking space as a condition for ADU permitting. This would be outside of that radius. To complete a parking study prior to adopting ADU ordinance parking requirements. If off-street parking is required, jurisdictions should develop standards and a process for parking waivers. And when they're developing parking requirements for ADUs, the jurisdictions should factor into their decision-making that the cost to construct off-street parking spaces is prohibitive for most homeowners, whether sufficient curb area exists to accommodate on-street parking, that the increase of impervious surface resulting from off-street parking spaces may run counter to stormwater management objectives, and the need for variability determined by the lot and the ADU size. Some best practices regarding lot requirements are ensuring ADU sizes are subordinate to the principal dwelling to support affordability and limit the impact on community facilities. Include specific zoning ordinance statements that remove ADUs from residential unit density calculations. The inclusion of ADUs in density calculations may prohibit their development in existing neighborhoods or limit overall unit production in new residential developments. Establish appropriate maximum ADU unit size and other bulk requirements such as setbacks, height of building, lot coverage. Do not require internal ADUs or ADUs that are converting an existing accessory structure into an ADU to consider lot requirements, as they do not impact building massing on the property. Restrictive covenants were discussed a lot, and the task force determined that restrictive covenants prevent one more barrier to property owners who want to construct an ADU for a family member or renter, lessening their viability as a housing product. The task force generally considered covenants restricting ADUs as a worst practice. However, it recognizes that it may be legally challenging to override them, and it's not something all planning departments deal with. This challenge may be particularly felt at the local level. The local government determination of impact fees should be allowed to the extent that they are not used in an unreasonable manner to create barriers. Impact fee waivers or reductions should be considered as an incentive for stimulating ADUs in targeted areas where they are desired. For infrastructure and facility, there is no reason for internal or attached ADUs to require a new water and sewer line. It is likely that an ADU would have no more than one bathroom, so the issue of allocating additional water or sewer capacity to the dwelling unit may not be needed. While in general, requiring new water or sewer connections to any or all ADUs is undesirable, there may be certain situations or properties based on topography or other characteristics that may require it from an engineering standpoint. Jurisdictions should have the authority to make this determination. Related to schools specifically, considered under facilities, an insight we received from the Montgomery County Planning Director during the panel discussion was that their office tracks ADU school impacts and has found that there has been no impact on schools since ADU legislation was first approved in 2014. Financial incentives and partnership best practices include grants or low-interest loans to help homeowners build ADUs, partnerships with nonprofits or other housing organizations to provide design support and or funding for homeowners, ADU feasibility and assessment tools, permitting ADU design and construction as eligible expenses in existing home repair loan programs. Government-directed technical assistance best practices include developing specialized application forms for ADUs, ensuring properly trained staff at the local level to advocate for ADUs, and promoting the efficient processing of ADU permits. This also includes publishing ADU FAQs and general resources for homeowners to navigate the local process of obtaining a building permit, and publishing sample plans for architectural elevations and floor plans. For non-conforming uses and structures, best practices establishing amnesty programs. One thing that the task force discussed is that there are many illegal ADUs out there, right? It's a very long-standing home product, residential product, and there are many illegal ones there. But when you establish amnesty programs, participating ADU owners can agree or will agree to fix some or all building code violations in exchange for explicit permission to continue renting an existing ADU. Now, I know I said a lot there and it's not written on the screen, but if you do go to the final report, you'll see these detailed. The task force also can discuss these other considerations for jurisdictions that you can find these in the report. Owner occupancy requirements, which are very common in ADU ordinances. There are pluses and minuses to these. Proponents argue that they limit property speculation and they can enhance aesthetics and maintenance of ADUs if the owner is living in the primary structure or the ADU itself. but they also may limit overall ADU development. Short-term rentals is a big issue everywhere, but also specifically with ADUs. In communities that are dependent on tourism or tourists, that's a big part of the economic driver of the community. Being able to permit ADUs as a short-term rental may make the legislation more palatable. It may increase the actual number of them and improve economic or help with economic development. However, ADUs used as short-term rentals may limit their affordability and supply as an actual housing product for residents. So you need to balance these considerations depending on your economic needs of your community. And then final, rental licensing programs. I already mentioned their connection, or they can be connected to amnesty programs, which I already described. These can be difficult to run though, and they may be more appropriate for high capacity jurisdictions. And when established, jurisdictions should consider waivers or streamlined processes for certain situations. So these are the final task force policy recommendations that they were developed in addition to those best practices. And there were 6 of them. So the state should pursue legislation which would require the permitting of one ADU as a by right use in most areas of Maryland whose zoning permits single-family residential uses. The state should not pursue legislation governing local parking requirements. This shows the complexity and difficulty of this topic. The state also should not pursue legislation governing local lot requirements for ADU approval. The state should pursue state legislation that would prohibit new and existing covenants for housing developments from barring or unreasonably restricting ADUs. The state should pursue legislation that limits impact fees that would unduly hinder the affordability of ADUs. And the state should pursue state legislation which would prohibit jurisdictions from requiring an ADU developer to install new and or separate water and sewer lines to the unit. Well, so it didn't stop with the publication of that task force report in May of 2024. HB 1466 was adopted during the 2025 General Assembly session and in many places referenced the task force report. Let's see here. Yeah, it becomes effective on October 1st of this year. But the requirement for local government ordinance adoption, which I'll describe, does not kick in until October 1st of 2026. So the restrictive covenant aspects of it, which I'm going to describe, kick in this October. So the requirements for the local governments, the required ordinance must permit ADUs on land with an existing single-family detached unit as a primary dwelling. So it's not based on zoning districts. It's based, or what the use allowances are. It's for those properties that have an existing single-family detached dwelling unit already on them. This ordinance is prohibited from counting ADUs towards residential density calculations, which we described earlier as a best practice, and it cannot establish setbacks that exceed those for existing accessory structure requirements. It does provide some allowances, though, for local governments in the adoption of this ordinance. They can be permitted by special exception. Adequate public facilities tests or APFO tests for schools or other facilities can be applied to ADUs. They can prohibit conversion of an existing accessory structure to an ADU if the only vehicular access to the structure is from an alley. And they can prohibit ADUs based on public health and safety and water or sewer capacity limitations. There's still some yet unanswered questions from MDP's perspective on this bill that we are exploring this summer. One is the restrictive covenant provision. It's clearly written in the bill itself, but it's not clear if it is retroactive. So we are exploring that this summer. The other one is a parking study requirement, which the bill says a parking study is required for any additional off-street parking for ADUs on properties with existing single-family detached home. And while that may seem clear, that any additional is not exactly clear if that's based on zoning district the requirements of that zoning district or other requirements. So we're looking into that, and it's not clear on what exactly a parking study will entail. So we're still looking into those. My final slide is talking about what we're doing at MTP to help jurisdictions comply with the law. As I mentioned, we don't have planning and zoning authority, but we do help Maryland cities and counties, try to help them comply with state requirements. So some potential resources we're considering are a model ordinance to help jurisdictions meet the requirements of what I mentioned. And we recognize that many jurisdictions in Maryland already have permit ADUs, and it may some don't. So there'll be varying levels of changes needed based on what is currently permitted. We're also considering written guidance, webinars, more detailed than this one, and FAQs. So right now, we're finalizing our communication to jurisdictions about those bill provisions. You know, some we know, and then there's still the ones that are yet unanswered. We want to make sure that we can communicate to them what we're doing and what the bill requires. We've already started, but continuing through next summer, we're going to be internally developing these resources. The task force compiled and developed a lot of resources, did a lot of analysis, a lot of examples that we're going to pull from to develop the resources listed at the top here. And we'll be designing and drafting them as we go. Starting in the first quarter of 2026, we'll be engaging with external partners like local governments, the Maryland Association of Counties, the Maryland Municipal League, and all the partners we developed through the task force process to get feedback on our proposed and draft resources. And then the idea is to publish, our goal is to publish the resources in late spring of 2026, giving jurisdictions enough time to use our resources to adopt those required ordinances by that deadline of October 1st of 2026. We're going to save questions for the end. I'm going to turn it over to Lynn, who's going to give it specific details about what Anne Arundel County is doing. And thank you. Sharing. Yep.
Thank you, Joe. I'm going to take a minute to share my screen. Okay, are you able to see that?
Yes, that looks great.
Great. Okay. So thanks, Joe, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for attending. I'm going to talk today about the process that we went through a few years ago to update our code relevant to ADUs and try to address some new goals. So I'm going to start with just a quick snapshot of Anne Arundel County, since I see we have people from all over the place and you might not be familiar with us. We're located on the Chesapeake Bay in between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. We're the home of the state capital, Annapolis. We are a large county. We have over 265,000 acres of land with lots of tidal shoreline. And we are a very diverse county in that we have urban areas, suburban areas, and rural areas, including a lot of ag preservation areas. So it makes planning very interesting because we have to cover the whole range of uh, types of land uses in the county. We're just over 600,000 in population right now. We've got about 226,000 households. About 16% of our population is over 65. That statistic does seem to be trending upwards. That's probably true in a lot of places, which is somewhat relevant when you're talking about ADUs. Our median household income is getting close to 117,000. This is actually from a couple of years ago, so it's might be a little higher now. That is higher than the nationwide median and in the top 3 or 4 jurisdictions in Maryland, I think. And our median home value is over 500,000 today. So to give you an idea of how much we're growing in terms of residential growth, this chart shows our residential permit activity over the last 25 years, or from 2001 through 2004. And you can see earlier in the 2000s, we were running between 3,000 and 4,000 residential building permits per year. We, of course, had a big drop off during the Great Recession, which I'm sure a lot of you all experienced as well. And then once we got past that, we've been trending sort of in between 2,000 and 3,000 permits per year. Over the last few years since COVID, you can see we had a big drop off here, which I think was initially due to COVID and more recently is probably related to the increase in mortgage interest rates. But I will also add that this is a little misleading because even though it shows a large drop off in permit activity, we still have around, I think, 3,800 residential units in the pipeline, meaning they've already been approved, but they haven't pulled their building permits yet. And I think we have about 4,800 that are residential units that are in our office for review right now in the development review stage. So we are expecting that permit trend to start trending back up. And this is the same trends, but it shows you the breakdown in residential types. So 20 or so years ago, we were still permitting the majority of our residential units as single family residentials. And more recently, that has trended towards more townhomes, which is the orange, and multifamily, which is shown in blue. Um, so, Moving on to ADUs, we have allowed these in our zoning ordinance for a while now, but in the past, when I think it probably predated 2005 anyway, when these were allowed, the intent was primarily with the thought of senior citizens who wanted to age in place near family members without having to relocate to an assisted living facility. And so our code was set up to allow them, but they had to be internal to the principal structure. They had a limit on floor area of 1,000 square feet or a third of the principal dwelling's floor area. We did have a minimum lot size requirement of 14,000 square feet, and the principal dwelling had to be owner occupied, and we also had an off-street parking requirement. So for a while, this seemed to serve the purpose or the main need for ADUs, which seemed to be, again, coming from the elderly population who wanted to age in place with other family members. But as time has gone on, we have found this to be too limiting. Um, and not accomplishing all the goals that we needed to accomplish, particularly in terms of this minimum lot size. We have a lot of lots in the county that are zoned for single family residential uses, but that are not 14,000 square feet in size. So that was really limiting a lot of people who would have liked to have even an internal ADU. So a couple of years ago, we decided it was time to update the code and broaden our allowances for ADUs. Um, the new goals were, of course, to serve a wider range of the population. So we're no longer just talking about seniors who want to age in place. We're also thinking about empty nesters, recent graduates, young single adults, single parents, a wide range of people, basically anyone who wants to downsize. And there are a lot of people out there who do just want to live more simply. They don't want a lot of house to have to maintain these days. Our goals are also to try to help address the shortage in housing units that we have in general as our demand continues to outpace the supply. Also to try to address the lack of affordable housing in the county. And of course, this falls in line with growth principles. Um, Talking about affordability, the median rental prices in our county have increased over the last 10 or 15 years by, I think, something like 60%. And the median income of renters is not keeping pace with that. So it is getting increasingly hard for people who want to rent to find a home. I think the average rental price now is around $1,800 a month, which is not serving, a significant portion of the population. Okay, so moving on to the process. This is fairly standard process for doing planning legislation, but I wanted to hit a couple of points. We found that it was very helpful to do a lot of research up front. And I think even since we did our code update, there's a lot more information out there now. As Joe talked about, the state of Maryland has done a lot. So there are a lot of examples to be found in other jurisdictions. We looked at other counties in Maryland, but also at other um, code ordinances out in Oregon and Washington State and other parts of the country just to see what other people were doing. We looked for some model ordinances, and as Joe pointed out, the state has been working on one for Maryland. We did find the one that was published by AARP to be helpful, and I think even since we did our update, they may have come out with a newer model ordinance. So theirs is worth looking at, and APA, of course, has a lot of resources too. Collaboration was really important, particularly with the elected officials. We had one of our county council members who took a very lead role in crafting this legislation and working with us. And of course, it goes well beyond your planning and zoning agency. So we had to get input and collaboration from our Public Works Department, our Health Department, our Inspections and Permits Department, even aging. So if you're embarking on a code update, make sure that you collaborate with other local agencies outside of your planning department, who obviously they all have a stake in this. And then community outreach, of course, is key for any planning legislation, but particularly with ADUs. I saw a lot of people when they were responding to Joe's question about obstacles. A lot of people mentioned NIMBYism, and we ran into some of that too. So, getting your stakeholder groups involved, and that's including we included affordable housing. Stakeholders. We have constituent groups who represent just general community um, groups that track development activity in the county. So they were key to reach out to, um, as well as others. And of course, you all know you can do this in a variety of ways. You can do it through individual stakeholder meetings. You can have an advisory committee. You can use a website to push out a lot of draft ideas. But whatever approach you use to your community outreach, I think that's particularly important when you're talking about making changes to ADUs. And then along with that, the messaging and the way you message it is something to really put some thought into. And what we found was helpful was spending a lot of time talking about the wide range of applicability, the wide range of people who might be interested in owning and, more importantly, living in an ADU, because as some of you noted, and if planners know, a lot of the public has particular NIMBYs that they get very defensive about. One of them was related to the use of these as short-term rentals, which I'm sure you all can understand. There was a fear among communities that a lot of property owners would construct these and just use them as a short-term rental so that there would be this constant turnover on a weekly basis of people coming in and out of their community, parking all over the place, not being sensitive to the fact that it's, a primarily homeowner neighborhood. And so that was one of the main fears that we heard about when we started talking about allowing detached ADUs. Affordability can also sometimes be a NIMBY type of thing. People were concerned that homeowners would be renting them out just to lower income people, and suddenly they would have a lot of low income people roaming around in their neighborhood. And so those kind of attitudes they're out there, and you all are aware of that. So I think the more that you can talk about the range of people that these can serve, it's not just for short-term renters, it's for young graduates who are just starting out on their careers and who haven't built up a lot of income yet, or it's for single individuals who just don't want a lot of house and a lot of property to have to maintain. So it's not necessarily for low income people. It's not necessarily for short-term renters. So if you are looking at either updating or making new allowances for ADUs in your jurisdiction, some of the key decision points that we had to discuss and debate were, of course, the type. Are you going to allow them internally? I think most places already do, But our big question was, were we going to allow them as detached ADUs? Because prior to this, we did not allow them as detached. You're going to need to consider what zoning districts you're going to allow them in. I've seen examples of jurisdictions who allowed them only in certain residential districts, but not all, and that could be for a variety of reasons. We elected to allow them in all of our residential zoning districts. Whether you want to have a minimum lot size or not is a key question. We used to, now we don't. How many ADUs you want to allow per lot? The most common is one per lot, I believe, based on our research. But I think we saw a couple of examples where, given the lot size, property owners were allowed to have more than one, like maybe two ADUs. And then what type of dwelling unit? Do you only want to allow them on properties with a single family detached home? Do you also want to allow them on a property with a townhome or some other type of dwelling unit? You have to consider your unit size. Do you want to have floor area caps or not? Or do you want to regulate it just as a percentage of the principal dwelling? We've seen it done both ways. That may need to vary depending on whether you're talking about internal or detached ADUs. You're going to need to consider your bulk requirements. We actually did not end up changing much in the way of our bulk requirements. We already had bulk requirements in place for accessory structures, and we tended to use the same if for accessory dwelling units as well. But that's something you may need to consider. And then occupancy, of course, do you want it to be occupied by family members, long-term rentals, short-term rentals? It seems sort of intuitive that you would want to allow them to be used by renters, but we did find an example or two of jurisdictions who allowed detached ADUs, but they had to be occupied by a family member. So I don't know that we would recommend that, but then if you're a jurisdiction who's never allowed them at all, and this is a completely new thing, and you're kind of worried about public reaction, maybe that might be a way to start slow and then build on from there. And then there's other sort of miscellaneous things that you need to take into consideration. Do you want to require it to have a separate entrance? How are you going to deal with the addressing? Like in our jurisdiction, our public safety agencies particularly wanted the ADU to have the same street address, but with a different number. So, for example, if your street address was 910 Oak Street, your ADU would have to be addressed 910B Oak Street, things like that. Parking was a big point of discussion, whether to require it a separate space for your ADU, whether not to. And then design standards is also something that's worth considering. We did not elect to include design standards, but I've seen some interesting examples of other jurisdictions. Portland, Oregon comes to mind that has design standards for ADUs. That might be another good tool to use if you're thinking of allowing detached ADUs and it's going to be a new thing in your jurisdiction and you're getting some mixed public reaction to it and people are concerned about what it's going to look like, that might be a case where I think design standards might be worth considering. So with that, we did manage to get a bill passed in 2023. You can see from our cover page, there were one, two, three, four, five or six hearings with amendments. So it did take a while to get there. But what we ended up with, we allow all types of ADUs now, detached, attached, internal, in a garage, whatever. We did decide to have a floor area limit of 800 square feet or 50% of the principal dwelling. So that's your limit. If it's an internal unit, it doesn't have those types of limits. It just has to be smaller than the principal dwelling. We're allowing it in all of our residential zoning districts. We opted, after a lot of discussion, not to go with a minimum lot size. And we are allowing just one ADU per lot, and the principal dwelling on the lot has to be a single family dwelling. So we're not allowing them on a townhome lot or a duplex or other type of dwelling unit lot. In terms of occupancy, we did end up allowing that both the ADU and the principal dwelling can be rental units. But if either of them is going to be used as a short-term rental, then the other has to be occupied by the property owner. So that was sort of the compromise position, if you will, that we landed on because we did have a lot of debate on both sides of whether people liked or did not like the idea of allowing them as short-term rentals. We do require a separate entrance. We also decided not to go with an additional parking requirement. That's something we're going to have to monitor over time, see if it becomes problematic. We can always go back and amend our code if needed. But for now, we're not requiring any additional parking, and we also did not elect to use design standards, which is something else we could go back and amend in the future if we decide that we need to. So moving on into implementation, because this is new to our county, at least the detached ADUs are new. This bill became effective in July, or late June, early July 2023. So of course, the first year was slow as word was getting out. We only got about 11 building permits submitted for new detached ADUs. Last year, 2024, that number started to tick up. We got 29 applications submitted. We're getting a high volume of customer calls and inquiries about detached ADUs, so we are expecting that the permitting trends are going to continue to increase in coming years. I think the information is still fairly new. A lot of people are still trying to figure out how exactly to make this work. So along those lines, some of the challenges that we're running, not so much we, but I think some of the property owners are running into are mainly, some of it's just related to a lack of education and information that we're constantly improving on. A lot of people weren't well informed when they first contacted us about getting a permit to build a detached ADU, and they seem to not understand that for purposes of the code, a detached ADU is essentially another dwelling unit. So it has to meet all the same building code requirements, which includes, life safety requirements and structural building requirements as any other dwelling type. So that seemed to catch a few people by surprise. There were people who had a shed in their backyard and had, the idea that they would just easily be able to convert that to a dwelling unit and came in and found that there were actually a lot more building code requirements that they would have to meet. So I think that's just going to take more education of property owners and the public about the fact that this is an actual dwelling unit. It's not a shed. It's not a temporary structure. In our county, we do have a lot of areas that are on private well and septic and not public water and sewer. So I think that has caught some property owners off guard too, as they weren't realizing that they were going to need a separate septic field and septic reserve area and well field for their ADU. And then they came to find out that they didn't actually have enough acreage to do it. So that's an important consideration for property owners. And then as far as the zoning code, some people have contacted us with interest in a detached ADU and who thought that they had plenty of acreage on their lot to do it, have then once they've looked more closely into the lot coverage requirements, have found that they don't have the space that they need. So that's something that we can look at more in the future after we've had our code in place for a while. If we find that we need to make some adjustments to accommodate, we can certainly do that. So that's it for a quick run through of some of the factors that we had to consider when we did our code update. But we are happily had a lot of support when we went to the county council and not too much opposition. So we were able to get that passed. And as I said, we have gotten a lot of customer interest in detached ADUs. So we're expecting to see a lot more of them come online in the future. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lynn. And thank you, Joe. Let me go ahead and get set up here for my part of the presentation. Okay. Are we seeing that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Great. So thank you so much again. I'm Mike Novotny with Backyard Homes Building Company, and I will take you through the following. So I broke the presentation into 4 parts, and I'll take about 20 minutes to go through, and then I believe we're going to question and answer after that. So the first part, I'll just take a couple of minutes to give some familiarity with Backyard Homes Building Company. And then I'll take a few minutes to talk about why I see our customers building accessory dwellings. And then spend the bulk of the time on some of the typical rules we encounter. And then finally, some additional rules to consider that's really based on lessons learned as a practitioner, as a builder of accessory dwellings. So first, just to start with Backyard Homes Building Company, I founded this company about 5 years ago. We are based in the greater Washington, D.C. region. There's a host of jurisdictions that allow accessory dwellings by right, and they're listed here. The most recent was Falls Church City, who adopted their ordinance just a few months ago. Prior to that, Alexandria, Montgomery County, Arlington, and the District of Columbia all have by right ordinances on the books for accessory dwellings. Each one's a little bit different. But in general, they're all quite positive for detached accessory dwellings. Backyard Homes Building Company, we strictly build detached accessory dwellings, have not gotten into attached basement units. We're just staying in specifically that detached lane and trying to build the best product that we can for detached units. It's a special product. I can say just based on experience, there's a tremendous amount of demand by property owners for this product. I think some of that is even reflected in the number of people signed up for this webinar. I'm sure that y'all are, hearing from folks, more about accessory dwellings. I'll just share as a story when we first started building these in 2020 and 2021. I would have an open house after we substantially finished the product. And there were some open houses where literally I was bringing through groups of like 10 to 15 people at a time, literally every 10 to 15 minutes. It was crazy. It was awesome. Everybody that I toured through that were curious about these homes, I got nothing but good positive feedback. And so it was very encouraging early on to see that. When we first started, we designed a series of homes. These are rendered homes here, kind of the first generation design, all custom tailored to the local jurisdictions that allowed accessory dwellings at the time. And with any good home, they take on uniqueness and customization by each owner. Everyone that we work with, wants something a little bit different, and within the confines of the rules and regulations of where they live, we make it work. So you'll see a series of these are 1.5 story models, and then single story models in the middle. Typically in the 1.5 story models, we put a full bathroom upstairs and a full bathroom downstairs, so 2-bedroom. Typically 1 bedroom, open living room, kitchen. So here's some photos of the inside of these accessory dwellings. These are actual ones that we have built. And so you kind of get a flavor for what it looks on the inside, or how it looks on the inside, both with kitchen, living room, living area, bedrooms. Most of our accessory dwellings that we build can fit full-size furniture, queen bed, even king beds in some models. Typically, a 6-foot couch will fit fine, or maybe go, with a love seat and chair combo. We have breakfast bars. There's a decent amount. I wouldn't say it's, huge flexibility, because there's size constraints, but there's a decent amount of flexibility. Our models range from anywhere, I would say typically 500 square feet to about 800 square feet. And that's really driven by, the limits, by the jurisdiction. The latest Falls Church City adopted an ordinance up to 1,000 square feet. And I think that's going to be very positive for this product. And I think we'll be able to, have a little bit more design flexibility and meet clients where they want to be, where they want to go with these sorts of units. So let me go ahead and switch gears a little bit and just talk about why our customers are building accessory dwellings. And I will say probably the largest tranche of interest is in independent living for aging parents. There's also a significant interest for recent graduates and kids coming back from college and needing a place, wanting a place, where they grew up, and being able to start a new family. Those, I call them starter homes and sunset homes. Those are two big tranches of why people do it. It's not the only reason, but those are popular. We do come across a lot of families with family members with special needs where, they want to have some independent living, but it needs to be close by, and because assistance is required. I've had customers that downsize and retire into an accessory dwelling, and that frees up their primary house to either rent it for longer term income, or have their kids move in, and now you have generational living on the same property. And then, the last but not least is as a real estate investment. And I have a lot of clients that want to do it strictly as a real estate investment. They own the property already. They can put it to use. It can be a new source of income. At the same time, they're providing, market rate affordable housing for folks in that community. And, I started because the note at the bottom is, even if you're, building it for your parents, building it for your recent college grad, almost everybody I work with still needs the ability to rent it. At some point in the life of the building, it's, potentially changing uses. Maybe you rent it first while you're waiting for your college graduate to come out. Maybe you're not ready to retire, but in a few years you will, and let's rent it in the meantime, pay for the cost to build it, and then put it to use a different way. This product really wants to be and needs to be flexible in order for people to, spend the money and the time and effort to actually build these in their backyard. And so the idea of being able to rent it both on a long-term and a short-term basis, honestly, is very important, I think, for every one of my customers. And then the last thing that I would note is that in this area that we work in, typically the owner does need to reside on the property. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later, but it's a real restriction. And if that wasn't, if that impact wasn't there, if current landlords could build, I think you'd have a whole another swath of people that would want to build these as a real estate investment. And I think there's a lot of upside to that, but I'll talk about that again just a little bit later. So, kind of the biggest rule, obviously, square footage cap or footprint cap, or often both, is what we're working with them. And they're going to vary by jurisdiction. And I would offer this from a practitioner standpoint. Almost everybody asks if they can do a 2-bedroom. Again, if you're going to put the money, the time, the effort into building these in the backyard, you want a second bedroom, whether it's for an office or just flexibility in the home. And if your square footage cap or your footprint is too limited, you can only do that one bedroom. I think that's actually a real constraining thing. What I would recommend is allowing at least 900 square feet for a proper 2 bedroom, 2 bath unit. Could you fit it if it's a single story? Could you fit it in a little bit less? Sure. But if it's a story and a half or 2 story, you're going to need, 900 square feet plus. As I mentioned, Falls Church City just allowed 1,000 square feet. I think that's going to allow for the necessary design flexibility to do a nice 2 bedroom unit. In terms of setbacks, so we build these in urban areas, and my own experience is 5-foot setbacks from the rear and the side work great. In most jurisdictions, you can put a garage a foot off the property line. And so, okay, you put an ADU 5 feet off the property line, so it's a little bit more relief. And but it allows you to preserve the rest of your backyard for recreational use, right? If you have kids, dog, anything like that, you still want to preserve some backyard for your use. You don't want to put the ADU in the middle of your backyard and spike that backyard. But it also provides that 5 foot, provides enough relief. I think it's a good balance, where you're not right on top of your neighbor's property as well. You could go, some jurisdictions, you could go less than 5 feet, and that could be very appropriate in some jurisdictions. And I wouldn't say anything against that. It does get into some complexity with fire code requirements. If your neighbor's fence is a foot over the property line and, you're digging your footings right there next to it, I mean, it gets a little tight. So you need some room to build it as well. But by and large, I would say, don't go more than 5 feet unless you absolutely have to for some reason. Allow that flexibility in the backyard and allow people to preserve as much backyard as they can. I'll go to front setbacks as well. And what I've found is, no more forward than the principal home works really well. And what I'm showing you here is a project we did in Maryland. And so the yellow highlighted area is that's the area by the written rules, what was available, to them to put an ADU in. And because it had to be behind the rear building line of the home. And I think it was a huge mistake. And in this case, we actually had to go get a variance, which, I'm sorry, but not many people want to go, get a lawyer, go get a variance, go through the process, spend, the time and effort there. This owner did, and I'm happy they did. We got a variance to put it in the side yard. But if you look at the photo on the left, and the AD is labeled, it's 90 feet back off of the roadway. There's no reason why this shouldn't have been allowed to begin with in the side yard. Not every property is like this. I get that, but side yards are valuable spaces in a lot of cases for an accessory dwelling, especially on corner lots. I'll show that in a second. Here's another example of a project we built where the ADU is a corner lot. The AD is generally in line with that principal home, setback about the same amount from the public street. And I will say corner lots are just exceptional lots for accessory dwellings because they give it even more independence for those homes. But corner lots are also penalized because they have 2 front yards, basically. And so I would just urge caution when you're crafting your setbacks and looking at corner lots in particular. For some reason, I see corner lots are required to have some bigger setbacks than interior lots. I think it's a huge mistake. Corner lots really kind of lend themselves well to accessory dwellings. So whatever you can do to encourage that in those situations, I think makes a lot of sense. In terms of height, so I mentioned we primarily build 1.5-story homes, and that's really because of the jurisdictional rules. In the District of Columbia, you can do 2-story, you can do a full 2-story with a flat roof. But by and large, I see 1.5 stories in the areas we work with. It works if you have sufficient dormers and if you have a large enough footprint to fit stairs in. Regulation code required stairs to get upstairs and down. So it can work, but I would say if you had a full second story to work with, that would really give you some good design flexibility. And I think clients would appreciate that. I think customers would appreciate that. Of course, that also complicates a little bit about the setback discussion. If you're 5 feet off your neighbor's line and you're a full 2-story, it is a little bit taller than 1.5 stories. So, that's a discussion to be had for sure. But I would advocate for a full 2-story if you can do it. I think it helps, but we're making 1.5 work. A few other things. I'll get on a little bit of a soapbox for a second on owner residing on site requirements and rental requirements. And I'm going to advocate from my customer's position, which is there should not be a requirement for an owner to reside on the property. And here's if your goal is to encourage more market rate affordable housing. And the reason is this: I can't tell you how many landlords have called me and asked, "Hey, I have a rental home here. I want to put an ADU on it, and already a real estate investor. This makes all the sense in the world. I come on over and take a look at the property." And I have to tell them, "No, I can't, because you are not residing on the property, and that's the jurisdictional rule." If the folks on this webinar are interested in increasing market rate affordable housing, if that is a goal, then this requirement should not be on the books. It prevents like a whole class of people that are probably some of the most willing and interested in building an accessory dwelling and putting that money, that investment into it to build it. The same sort of goes for rental restrictions too. I think this is a real big one. I understand the discussion, the argument of, well, we don't want short-term renters, but there's a reality here that you can't build these accessory dwellings for free. You need to be able to pay for them, and a short-term rental is a perfectly good and justifiable way to pay for that investment and to make it work. And maybe it's a combination of short-term and long-term rentals. I mean, as a landlord, you don't know all the time what's going to work best in your market. But I would advocate for the flexibility for rental, and as a way to pay for the home to be built. In terms of the additional parking space, this is something. So again, we're working in these urban areas. None of the jurisdictions that I work in require an additional parking space unless there's nothing on site. And everybody has at least one space on site, because it's required for their principal home. The rest is street parking, and I'm not aware of any issues, no issues whatsoever that I have come across in any of the homes that I've built for clients. An ADU does not create, a huge, it doesn't drive a huge parking demand, right? But there's typically street parking. Now, you may be in a jurisdiction that isn't set up for that, and I totally understand that. But if you're in an urban area with street parking, I feel like adding a parking requirement is really a poison pill to ADUs, because most homes don't have the room for a second driveway, or don't necessarily, have the room or the desire to continue to kind of push that driveway back deeper into the property. There's also negatives of adding more impervious surface to your property, adding another curb cut on your street. So I would strongly encourage avoiding the additional parking requirement, again, unless there's no parking already outside. And I think there's a reasonable case that, okay, if you don't have any parking, let's add a space in that case. But from what I'm seeing, the no parking is working fine in the jurisdictions we work in. I believe basements came up earlier, and that is a question, or I think I saw a question in the thread, maybe that's it, about basements and do you count the square footage? It's sort of what I'm seeing in jurisdictions that we're in, it's sort of a mixed bag. Some count it, some don't. I don't do a lot of basements because in most cases I'm in a jurisdiction where they do count it towards square footage. And, if you only have, 800 square feet, why would you put it in the basement, put it above grade? I don't know what the right answer is there. I would say if you're building, there's some complications to doing a basement, where, it's a much bigger excavation in an existing property. And you have to, now you're talking about tree roots and stuff like that. So there are trade-offs. I'm not necessarily advocating for basements. I think, I do have some customers that would like one. But typically, we're not building them at this point. But it's a question for you if you're drawing new rules up. And then, windows, there's always discussion about windows facing neighbor properties. I would just say, please allow them. I don't know, I think it's actually worse to have a big blank wall facing your neighbor. But these are for me, the crux is that, detached accessory dwellings are not meant to be basement apartments. They're meant to be better than that with light coming in and making them very, very positive and livable. And when you start to restrict windows, I think that's problematic, honestly, from a design and a livability standpoint. And if you're close to the property line and you have first floor windows, I think there's a basis for potentially making sure there's some screening or some fence, similar to how you would address mechanical in the code. Okay, so I want to hit on a few more things, and I'm switch gears now to additional rules to consider. These are lessons learned based on the projects that we have built, in this area. One is, it's almost universal. I see jurisdictions when they adopt ADU rules, they don't think about the mechanical. They don't raise the mechanical, and it always becomes an issue with where you put that compressor. And in this map here that I'm showing, this is a project where the compressor wants to go into this corner that we're showing. You see that red rectangle. And it's less than 5 feet from the property line on one side and about 3 feet from the rear property line. It's fenced in, 6-foot fence on both sides. It's a mini split compressor, which is super quiet. If you have any experience with mini splits, it's like a big fan. And at 50, I think it's rated at 52 decibels at a maximum. So it's not something that anyone even hears. And in this case, it was a struggle, honestly, because the ADU only requires a 1-foot setback, but the compressor required a 7-foot setback. And so, for reasons that, I won't dive into too much, it wasn't easy to just put the compressor on a different side, right? We have windows, we have doors, we have other parts happening on the other two facades of the ADU. But it's an example of the mechanical not being addressed at the same time as the ADU when the policies are adopted. And in this case as well, there was a release valve where, as years of common practice, not necessarily ordinance, but it's just common practice that they would issue a waiver if the neighbor consented, right? So now we have a by right accessory dwelling, but the neighbor has to approve it. Otherwise, the ADU honestly might not be built because it's a pretty tight backyard. So it kind of puts neighbor versus neighbor, and think about the mechanical would be my strong advice as you're adopting rules. and allow them the quieter mechanicals within the AD setbacks is what I would suggest. Okay, so another issue I've come across is attics, and if that square footage is counted, especially in the case if you have a square footage cap. And I would just say, advocate for excluding that square footage, whether it's an attic or a loft. It does not change the exterior envelope of the home. And I think that's what the square footage cap is really getting at. But on the interior, if you have an attic, if you have a, just a gable roof like is shown in the picture here, and you have an attic or you have a loft, it doesn't really change anything on the outside. But it does impact the square footage cap. And so in this case, on the right-hand side, I'm showing an attic above where it was strictly mechanical. It's not even, maybe the owner would use it for storage, but it wasn't livable, but it was still, there's still a requirement to count it towards the square footage. So it changes everything in your design. You have to shrink the ADU. It's unnecessary. There's another scenario here that, I think would be thoughtful when you're coming up with ADU rules is to exclude attached garages from a square footage cap or a footprint limit. This is a design that I would love to be able to deploy and build. And right now in the jurisdictions I work in, I'm actually not able to because it's counted that attached garage, even though separated by a party wall, is actually included in the ADU square footage cap. And so I would advocate again to not include that. Another big one is covered porches. And so what I found is that a lot of zoning ordinances for single family homes are constructed, the way they're constructed, for a reason. They have definitions for what meets GFA. But they don't have single family homes are typically not under a square footage cap. And then you add an accessory dwelling with a square footage cap. And now you have all these other issues of what counts as GFA, what doesn't. And I have some jurisdictions where literally a covered front porch, but otherwise open, is counted as GFA, i.e. it's counted towards the square footage cap. And basically anything with a column supporting a roof is counted as GFA. I don't think that's, uncommon, but it's too bad because it dissuades someone from building a cute front porch on these homes, and something that I'm not able to do, but I know my customers would appreciate it, and it does not, again, change really much of anything, except it gives the owners a little outdoor space with their ADU. So I would say to exclude the covered porches from any kind of square footage cap. Two final things to talk about is adding potentially adding a percentage increase to your lot coverage. Most jurisdictional rules still require you to meet lot coverage, which makes sense. But if you gave a small bonus in your lot coverage, I think you would be able to incentivize more ADUs in tighter situations. And then the last thing I'll mention is a little bit of an aspirational thing for me, which is to allow, think about allowing small clusters of homes on larger lots. It's not without precedent. Actually, if you've ever heard of bungalow courts, that's the first, small home community. I think it was in 1909 in Pasadena, California. Southern California has some examples. I was fortunate enough to, go look at, some examples a couple of years back of these, like one large block with just like detached accessory dwelling size, single floor homes. And, they share a common courtyard. Personally, I think it'd be a very interesting product. It would encourage some additional market rate affordable housing. And it's something that, all right, that might be a little bit of a future step, but I would encourage you all to think about that down the road. So with that, I'm going to conclude my comments. I really appreciate it, and I love all the interest in accessory dwellings. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mike, Lynn, and Joe. We have had a number of questions come in, so I'm just going to dive right in. And admittedly, I have been hopping between the chat here, the Q&A, and the YouTube. So if at any point I pose a question that you've already covered in your presentation that I may have missed, feel free to say so, or feel free to expand if you find it to be applicable. So our first question that I'm going to pose is, do you have any specific feedback or guidance related to allowing or encouraging ADUs in buildings that are locally designated as a historical landmark or in a historic district, dealing with ADU requirements that will result in changes to the building's exterior, like adding entrances, fire suppression, etc.?
I mean, I'll start. Mike probably has run into this more than me. I would say the Maryland Historical Trust is part of the Maryland Department of Planning, and when we were going through the task force, we talked with the MHT, and this is not going to deal with the details, but ADUs are a historical housing product, and that our historic preservationists would encourage it. Of course, design requirements could still apply. That are the other historic preservation design requirements they have. Specific to entrance locations, I'd have to think about that more. But at least our historic preservationists would push back against the idea that historic districts would not allow ADUs when that is a classic house. Mike, do you have any experience with that?
So I would say this: his historic preservation is typically tied to a historic structure, and there's nothing about a detached ADU that actually impacts the historic structure. And in fact, it might actually support the ability to still live in that historic structure while you add a detached ADU in the backyard. If the question is referring more to an interior AD, that's something I don't have experience with. But I have, worked with local jurisdictions and talked to them about, detached accessory dwellings vis-a-vis historic properties. And that's really kind of where it comes down to, which is it's not really the property that's historic, it's the structure. And we're not touching the structure. So, we're kind of, pushing past it and building the AD behind it. So.
Thank you, Joe and Mike. Already, another question I see is, I've seen examples of ADUs built along both sides of an alley, with the alley functioning as a narrow access street. What options are there for access via an alley? Excuse me.
I don't know if I can answer it directly either. That one either. The mayor, if you saw when I was describing the General Assembly or the bill that was passed in this past session, they did make a specific carve out saying that jurisdictions could, in the ordinance they create, could restrict the conversion of accessory structures to ADUs if the only access to it was by alleys, with understanding that difficulty. I know there was some jurisdiction or two that expressed that concern during the hearing on that bill. That's the best answer I can give right now. But I know, I mean, I live in Baltimore, and Baltimore is known for its alley homes, and I actually used to live in one, and accessing them is not usually a bigger problem. I mean, parking is going to be very, very difficult. You're not going to find parking along those alleys, but they're always filled, and it's a valued housing product.
Thank you. An attendee asks, are there any resources or metrics that they can use that describe how ADUs impact public transportation options or development in various jurisdiction types?
The actual, Lynn, maybe you came across this in your research. I mean, our best practices research, we suggested not requiring off-street parking spaces for, TOD proximate properties, but the actual impacts on transit ridership, I'm not sure if we found that. Lynn, did you find anything?
Yeah, I'm not sure either. We may have some, there may be something in some of the resources that we collected, but off the top of my head, I don't know that I can speak to impacts on transit ridership.
Alrighty. When a new subdivision comes in, single family detached, are they required to include ADUs as part of their water sewer demand supply since it's allowed by right?
I would imagine so. I mean, that's going to vary state by state, locality by locality.
Yes, in our jurisdiction, that does have to be factored into your adequate public facilities testing.
Thank you.
Gillian, I would just add, uh, I'm not familiar with, new subdivision coming in and the HOA rules or anything like that, but an ADU is no different than building an addition with another bathroom on it. So we're not, it shouldn't be misconstrued with something, much bigger and more extensive. When you build a new home subdivision, certainly there is water and sewer capacity for someone to add add an addition on their home. So I don't see it as any different necessarily than just a normal single family home development.
Thank you. Let's see, another one. Can Mike talk about occupation restrictions affecting financing? It would be helpful to hear this perspective.
Well, I would just say this. I mean, financing of the ADUs is probably one of the biggest levers right now, biggest issues right now, because financing is more expensive. Just when I started the business 5 years ago, that was a different world, where mortgage rates were much lower and people were able to finance them. The ability to finance them going forward, I think, ADU development would be boosted. If whether it's federal, state level, there were some kind of funding programs. I know there has been discussion at the federal level. I think some states do talk about it at state level, but to have a financing mechanism would be very, very important. Right now, if you, I'm not sure about the owner occupancy requirement, but if you're intending to rent it, for example, I don't believe you can, get a loan based on future rental income. But if you could, right, if those financing conditions change and you could, then that would help. That would help people be able to afford to build these. So anything that can be done on the financing end, would be amazing, because right now we're kind of in a world where it is a lot more expensive now to finance the construction of these.
Thank you. Financing was one of the most commonly asked questions. Let's see. I have a question here. It says, how is universal design incorporated or encouraged in ADUs? I'm not sure who would be the best to take that.
I mean, I would,
Probably Mike.
yeah, we build, a lot of them for, again, like aging parents, right? So, there are grab bars, right, in the bathroom. Most of these are built slab on grade, and if there needs to be a small ramp, and a small ramp is put in. If there's a bathroom on the first floor, the door has to, by code actually, has to be 36 inches. I'm sorry, 34 inches wide to the bathroom, if there's a bathroom and with a shower or tub on the first floor. So, we do, but I typically, build it with wider doors anyway to make it more accessible in that sense. If the owner has any, additional considerations, requirements, it's something that we absolutely build in.
Thank you.
I would add, Gillian, that as I noted, we elected not to include any design standards for our ADUs, at least at this point in time. But we did see examples of local codes that required that the primarily relating to the ADU exterior, if it's a detached, that it has to be a similar architectural style. It has to be built with similar exterior siding and other materials. I think with the goal of having it blend in more with the property or the neighborhood in general. So I think that's something that can be considered. And we elected not to, but there could be benefits to including those kind of standards.
Thank you. And I think we're just about 1 minute over time, so I think this will have to be our last question, unfortunately. But regarding short-term rentals, we have a question, I think, from an attendee in Delaware who's asking about any experience with working with ADUs into a form-based code. Has there been any way to work around short-term rentals? They know that that's a concern for their area, and they're trying to generate more affordable housing.
Uh, can you, I'm not sure the connection between the form-based codes and the short-term rental aspects of the question.
Let me just
Repeat
read
it.
it repeat it as written. Has anyone experienced has anyone have any experience working with working ADUs into form-based code? Has there been any way to work around short-term rentals? I know that's a concern for us. It may be, and keep in mind, I am not a planner by trade, and so I'm only adjacent to the field. So it could be that these are two entirely separate topics, but they're just. I suppose the last part of the question is just looking around short-term rentals and trying to promote housing affordability.
Bree, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm entirely understanding the question either, but the inquiry may be thinking of strategies to make an allowance for short-term rentals more feasible or more palatable to the community. So maybe the thought is if you're weaving it into some kind of form-based code, you're better able to address either the aesthetics or the design parameters of the property that might make it might make the public more comfortable with the idea of short-term rentals. But I'm not quite sure how you would. I think the question of using them as short-term rentals, to my understanding and based on our discussion, it goes beyond just the aesthetics or the design aspects of the ADU. It had more to do with impacts to the neighborhood in terms of, parking or, constant changeover of tenants staying there who might not, be as sensitive to property upkeep as you would be if you were a long-term renter. So it's those types of impacts less than design related.
Thank you, Lynn. And we are almost 5 minutes over, so I'm sorry to say we do have to just be respectful of everyone's time here. Thank you.
Jillian, I want to say
Yeah, go
one
ahead.
thing you might have missed. There's a couple requests. This has been like the most active chat I've ever seen in a webinar. There's been a couple requests that we could save the chat and send it out to attendees because there's a lot of links in there. I'm not sure if you normally do that. I just want to make sure before you close it or anything, you can do that.
I am letting folks know I'm going to put my email in the chat box. You are more than welcome to email me and I can send you a copy of the chat. That is just going to be the easiest way to do it this time around, just given the high number of attendees. So my APA Virginia email is in the chat. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions about the resources that were provided or if you want access to the chat summary. And we also will be posting well, this webinar, it will be immediately available on the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration YouTube page, but we will also be sharing resources for this webinar on the MAPC site subpage of the Virginia chapter page. I just want to thank Mike, Lynn, and Joe so much for being with us this afternoon, for sharing your insights and best practices around ADUs, especially given given the need for addressing housing needs. So thank you so much to everybody for being here. We're thrilled with the level of interest in this subject.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.